My name is Claire. I am a 28-year-old staff sergeant in the United States Army currently stationed at the desolate, windswept Fort Carson in Colorado, and 10 minutes ago, I learned that my existence is officially considered a logistical error by the people who shared my DNA. I was sitting at my cluttered government-issue laminate desk, the kind that smells permanently of industrial floor wax and stale Folgers coffee, staring at a stack of DA Form 2062s that needed signatures. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a migraine-inducing frequency, flickering against the drab walls of the logistics office. My fingers, calloused from years of handling heavy equipment and the biting cold of field rotations, were wrapped tightly around my battered iPhone 13 Pro Max, the screen a spiderweb of cracks from a drop on the tarmac at Bugram years ago. I had a single notification, a voicemail from my mother, Eleanor. I hit play, expecting perhaps a belated birthday wish or a half-hearted check-in, but instead, I was met with the crisp, curated tone of a woman who views her children as social capital. "Claire, it's Mom," she began, her voice devoid of any maternal warmth, sounding more like a CEO delivering a quarterly layoff notice. "I'm calling to let you know that Madison is finally marrying Julian next month at the Glass Pavilion at the Denver Botanic Gardens. It's going to be a sunset ceremony, very exclusive, very refined. We've decided it's best if you don't attend. We want to keep the guest list small and, frankly, stress-free. Your sister deserves a day without any military intensity or reminders of your career choices. It's just better for the aesthetic of the event. Don't call back to argue, our minds are made up." The call lasted exactly 42 seconds, a digital execution that cost me nothing but my pride, yet felt like a physical blow to the solar plexus. I sat there in my OCP uniforms, the fabric stiff with starch, feeling the weight of the U.S. Army patch over my heart as if it were a target. Madison, my younger sister by 3 years, the golden child, who spent her days posting curated brunch photos from her loft in the Pearl District while I was pulling 12-hour shifts in the motor pool, was getting married in a 5-figure glass venue. The Glass Pavilion in Denver was a place of architectural perfection, a soaring structure of steel and transparent plates that cost roughly $3,000 just to reserve for a 4-hour window, not including the premium catering from companies like Footers that charged upwards of $200 per plate. My knuckles turned a ghostly white as I gripped the edges of my phone, the sharp glass of the cracked screen digging into my palm. I could almost smell the expensive lilies and the Joe Malone peony and blush suede candles my mother undoubtedly had on the mood board for the wedding. I was the distraction. I was the rugged, unpolished piece of hardware that didn't fit into their soft porcelain world. While I was calculating fuel consumption for a convoy of Oshkosh MAT-verses, they were debating between champagne or ivory linens. The injustice of it didn't just hurt. It burned with a slow, steady heat that made the dusty air of the base feel even thinner. I had spent my entire adult life serving a country that valued me more than my own mother did, and as I stared at the blinking cursor on my computer screen, the realization settled in that to them, I wasn't a hero or even a daughter. I was a liability to their social standing, a stain on a stress-free afternoon. But I'm getting ahead of myself because they forgot one very important detail about people who wear this uniform. We don't just disappear because we're told we aren't wanted. Family isn't supposed to be a curated guest list, and sometimes the most stress-free environments are the ones that need a reality check the most. I looked down at my monthly LES statement on the desk, seeing the modest base pay of a staff sergeant, and then at the voicemail icon, realizing that my silence was the only thing they thought they had bought. They were wrong. Now let me take you back to the foundation of this fracture, long before I wore a name tape on my chest and boots caked in the red dust of training ranges. We grew up in a meticulously manicured suburb of Hartford, Connecticut, in a sprawling 5,200 square foot custom-built colonial that my father, a high-stakes construction mogul with a penchant for Italian marble and zero-tolerance policies, valued at exactly $1.2 million back in 2008. In that house, affection was a currency I never seemed to possess, while Madison was born with a silver spoon and a platinum safety net. The contrast between us wasn't just a sibling rivalry. It was surgical, a deliberate carving of our identities by parents who viewed children as extensions of their own brand. Madison was the golden child, a living porcelain doll who glided through the gleaming hallways in $400 Ralph Lauren silk dresses and hand-stitched leather Mary Janes that never saw a speck of dirt. I remember the suffocating silence of her piano recitals at the Hart School, where the air smelled of expensive hairspray and lilies, and my father would sit in the front row, beaming as she played Chopin on a Steinway, his pride practically radiating off his charcoal-gray Armani suit. When she finished, the applause was thunderous, and he'd later present her with jewelry from Tiffany & Company just for showing up. I was the spare part, the jagged edge that didn't fit the blueprint of their perfect New England life. While my father was cutting checks for $150,000 to cover Madison's Ivy League tuition at Yale, ensuring she had every tutor, every internship and every advantage money could bribe, I was the one mowing the 3-acre lawn on a John Deere X738 until my hands vibrated and my skin was burned lobster red. I learned the value of $1 not through an allowance, but by watching them spend it on everyone but me. I remember the day I told them I wasn't going to a private liberal arts college to study finding myself on their dime. My father didn't even look up from his Wall Street Journal. He just adjusted his gold Rolex Submariner and told me that if I wasn't going to be an asset to the family name, I was on my own. So I chose the grid of the United States Army, traded the designer labels for a rough-spun uniform that cost the government less than Madison's brunch shoes, and headed to Fort Moore for basic training. I traded the climate-controlled comfort of our Hartford estate for the humid, mosquito-infested woods of Georgia, where respect isn't inherited through a surname or a bank balance, but earned through sweat, blood, and the ability to carry a 60-pound ruck for 12 miles without collapsing. In the military, my father's construction empire meant nothing. My sergeant didn't care about the square footage of my childhood bedroom or the brand of the car in our driveway. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the shadow in Madison's spotlight. I was a soldier with a purpose. Yet standing here now in my office at Fort Carson, looking at the dust motes dancing in the harsh light, the sting of that voicemail feels like a cold Connecticut winter. They spent a fortune to build a life where I was an architectural flaw, a load-bearing wall they decided they didn't need anymore. But what they never understood is that while they were polishing the glass for Madison's pavilion, I was becoming the steel that holds the world together. They think they can just delete me from the blueprints of their lives because I'm not aesthetic enough for a sunset wedding in Denver, but they've forgotten that you can't build a glass house on a foundation of lies and expect it to withstand the weight of the truth. Family isn't about the blood in your veins or the pedigree on your diploma. It's about who stands beside you when the prestige fades and the real work begins. The silence following that voicemail was a vacuum that sucked the oxygen right out of my lungs, so I did something I knew I would regret. I hit the contact name Madison and watched the call connect as I leaned against the cold metal filing cabinet of my office. She picked up on the third ring, and immediately the background noise of a high-end bridal boutique in Cherry Creek leaked through the speaker. A cacophony of hushed professional voices and the clinking of champagne flutes. When I asked her point-blank why I was being discarded like a piece of faulty equipment, she let out a sharp melodic laugh that sounded like crystal shattering on a marble floor, a sound so practiced and effortless it probably cost more in private vocal coaching than my monthly $400 grocery bill at the commissary. "Claire, darling, don't be so dramatic," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension usually reserved for a waiter who brought the wrong vintage of Pinot Grigio. "This wedding is a celebration for the people who actually built this life with me, the people who understand the vision Julian and I have for our future, and honestly, your presence just doesn't fit the narrative of a sophisticated Denver event." I stood there in my scuffed combat boots, the scent of stale motor oil and CLP gun cleaner clinging to my uniform, feeling the bitter sting of her words settle into my bones like a physical infection. It wasn't just about a seat at a table or a piece of overpriced fondant cake. It was the realization that she had effectively erased 28 years of shared history because I chose a Kevlar helmet over a corporate corner office in our father's construction empire. Madison continued to chirp about the floral arrangements from a florist who charged $500 per centerpiece while I stared at the peeling gray paint on the base office wall, my heart hammering a rhythmic, angry cadence against my ribs. She made it clear that my parents hadn't just suggested this exile. They had fully sanctioned it, providing the financial backing for a glass-walled sanctuary where the spare part wouldn't be allowed to ruin the lighting. My father, the man who taught me that a structure is only as strong as its foundation, was now happily paying for a facade that purposefully left me out of the blueprints. But I'm getting ahead of myself because as the line went dead and the dial tone hummed in my ear, the crushing weight of their rejection began to crystallize into something much harder and colder than sadness. I looked down at my hands, which were stained with the faint residue of graphite from the morning's inventory, and compared them to the image of Madison's manicured fingers wrapped around a glass of Veuve Clicquot. They wanted a life of aesthetic perfection, a world where the messiness of service and the grit of reality were filtered out by triple-pane glass and social standing. They saw my uniform as a betrayal of their brand, a loud, jarring noise in their quiet, expensive symphony. What they didn't realize is that while they were busy building a cage of glass and calling it a kingdom, I was learning how to survive the elements they were so afraid of. The realization that my own blood viewed me as a distraction rather than a sister was the final bolt snapping in the bridge between us. Family isn't the people who invite you to the party when the sun is shining. Family is the people who don't care if you bring the storm with you. As I turned back to my desk to finish my reports, I knew that the stress-free wedding they were planning was about to face a variable they hadn't accounted for in their expensive spreadsheets. Stress is something I deal with every single day at the motor pool, and I was starting to realize that if I was already cast as the villain in their story, I might as well play the part with the precision I'd been trained for. That night, the silence in my Spartan 450-square-foot apartment just outside the perimeter of Fort Carson was heavy, punctuated only by the distant rhythmic hum of a passing striker on the main road and the occasional rattle of my outdated window AC unit. The space was a stark utilitarian contrast to the vaulted ceilings and heated limestone floors of my childhood home in Hartford, furnished with nothing but a sagging olive-drab sofa I'd bought for $50 from a departing corporal and a scarred wooden table that served as my dining room, office and command center. I didn't cry because tears are a luxury for those who still believe the world owes them kindness, and the army had long ago beaten the habit of self-pity out of my system during those freezing pre-dawn rucks at Fort Moore. Instead, I reached into the back of my cramped kitchenette cabinet and pulled out a bottle of $9 Evan Williams bourbon, the kind that burns going down but settles the nerves with a blunt, honest heat. I poured a generous measure into a chipped mug, a souvenir from a deployment that simply said, "Embrace the suck," and sat down at the table, spreading out a yellow legal pad and clicking a matte black Fisher Space pen into readiness. Under the harsh, unshielded light of a single 60-watt bulb, I began to draft a different kind of manifest, one that had nothing to do with the aesthetic of a sunset wedding or the social standing of a construction mogul's daughter. I started listing my achievements with the cold, calculated precision of an after-action report, my handwriting steady despite the adrenaline still humming in my veins from the day's rejection. I wrote about the time I led a 12-vehicle convoy of M1078 light-medium tactical vehicles through a blinding Category 4 rainstorm in the mountains, navigating mud-slicked hairpins where one wrong move would have sent millions of dollars of equipment and 24 souls screaming into a ravine. I noted my current responsibility of managing a $2.4 million equipment budget, accounting for every bolt, tire and radio with a level of integrity my father couldn't fathom while he was busy inflating invoices for his luxury developments. These weren't just bullet points on a resume. They were the scars and stripes of a life built on merit rather than a trust fund. And as the amber liquid in my mug disappeared, the clarity of my situation became as sharp as a bayonet. I sat there staring at the yellow paper, the ink glistening under the light, and I finally accepted the cold, hard truth that had been gnawing at me since I was 18. My family's love was a closed shop, a private club with a membership fee I was no longer willing to pay in the currency of my own dignity. Madison and my parents had built a fortress of glass and high-interest debt, a world where you were only as valuable as the reflection you cast in their polished mirrors, and I had been trying to force my way back into a building that was never designed with an entrance for me. I realized that I didn't need their validation to confirm my worth any more than a tank needs permission from a tricycle to cross a battlefield. The exile they had sanctioned wasn't a punishment. It was a release from the exhausting labor of trying to be a person I never wanted to be in the first place. I looked at the scratch on my iPhone 13, the one that had carried the voice of my sister erasing our history, and I felt a strange, terrifying sense of peace wash over me. I was a staff sergeant in the United States Army, a woman who had survived things that would make Madison faint in her $400 dress, and I was officially retiring from the business of begging for a seat at their table. Family isn't a bloodline you're trapped in. It's a tactical alliance you choose, and as I capped my pen, I knew that the bridge to Hartford wasn't just burned, it was demolished, and I was the one who had finally pulled the lever. The days that followed that bourbon-soaked realization were characterized by a tactical silence that my family likely mistook for submission. But in the military, we know that the quietest moments are usually when the most significant maneuvers are being executed. I pivoted with the mechanical precision of a synchronized convoy, shifting my focus entirely away from the frantic high-gloss drama of Madison's Denver wedding and toward a secret I had guarded more fiercely than a classified comms key. A relationship with a man who saw the woman behind the rank and loved her for the very intensity my mother found so distasteful. 2 weeks later, I found myself in a sleek, glass-walled office in San Diego, a space that felt like a deliberate mockery of the pavilion my sister was so obsessed with, though this one smelled of expensive roasted espresso and fresh-cut stargazer lilies rather than desperation and hairspray. The coordinator across from me, a woman named Genevieve whose professional fee alone was $3,000 a day, looked at my military ID and then at my bank statements with the calculating gaze of a strategist. I wasn't just there to plan a wedding. I was there to orchestrate an ascent that would render my family's Connecticut colonial look like a dollhouse in comparison to the life I was building. While Madison was busy picking out $12 per unit embossed invitations, I was sitting down with a top-tier legal team in a high-rise overlooking the Pacific, a firm where the mahogany tables were polished to a mirror finish and the hourly rate for a junior partner started at $550. I didn't come to them for a prenuptial agreement in the traditional sense. I came to ensure that every cent of the assets I had painstakingly accumulated, investments made with combat pay from my time in the sandbox, hazard pay, and the disciplined savings of a woman who never had a safety net, was shielded and legally cauterized from any future claims my father might try to manufacture. I sat there in a crisp, tailored navy blazer that hid the tension in my shoulders, watching as the lead attorney, a man who charged $800 an hour to breathe, drafted documents that created a legal fortress around my portfolio of diversified index funds and the 3 rental properties I'd quietly acquired near various bases. My family had always treated me like a financial liability or a charity case, never realizing that while they were spending their capital on social optics and German SUVs, I was building a private empire on the backs of 14-hour shifts and tactical discipline. The scent of the office was intoxicating, a mixture of high-end leather and the crisp ozone of the ocean air drifting through the HVAC system, and for the first time in my life, I felt like the architect of my own destiny rather than a footnote in someone else's blueprint. I authorized the transfer of a $25,000 retainer to the legal firm, a sum that would have made my mother's head spin, feeling a cold, professional satisfaction as the digital transaction cleared with a soft chime. They wanted a life of aesthetic perfection, but they were building it on credit and the crumbling remains of a construction business that my father was too arrogant to realize was plateauing. I was building mine on concrete and steel, protected by the most expensive legal minds money could buy, ensuring that when the dust finally settled on Madison's little glass party, I wouldn't just be standing, I would be untouchable. I looked out the window at the San Diego skyline, the sun reflecting off the water in a way that no Denver pavilion could ever replicate, and I realized that my exile was the most profitable thing that had ever happened to me. Family is supposed to be your foundation, but when the foundation is cracked, you don't keep trying to patch the drywall. You tear the whole thing down and build something that can actually withstand a storm. I wasn't just a sister they could discard anymore. I was a variable they hadn't even begun to calculate, and the silence I was giving them was the most expensive gift they would ever receive. 14 months is a lifetime in the world of tactical maneuvers and high-stakes transitions, and as I stood on the teak deck of a 150-foot custom Benetti megayacht anchored in the shimmering, sapphire waters off the Amalfi Coast, the dusty motor pools of Fort Carson felt like a fever dream from a previous incarnation. My name is Claire, and today I am marrying Julian, a man whose intellect and drive match my own, a Texio I met not at a curated debutante ball, but during a grueling joint military-civilian logistics summit where we spent 18 hours straight debating supply chain resilience under duress. The setting is a masterpiece of maritime engineering, a vessel that costs upwards of $250,000 just to charter for a week, featuring a glass-bottomed pool and a crew that anticipates every need before it is even articulated. The air carries the scent of expensive sea salt, blooming lemon groves from the cliffs of Positano, and the faint, crisp aroma of a vintage 2012 Dom Perignon that flows freely into Baccarat crystal flutes. My guest list is a deliberate assembly of 60 elite individuals, a powerful collective of high-ranking military officers in their dress whites and international venture capitalists who value substance over social posturing, creating a perimeter of genuine respect that my family could never breach. I am wearing a bespoke $12,000 silk gown designed by a private atelier in Milan. A garment that fits like a suit of armor, its clean lines and heavy fabric echoing the discipline I've carried in my marrow since I first laced up my combat boots. My posture is a product of years of drill and ceremony, a spine of tempered steel that makes me tower over the memories of the girl who once begged for a seat at a glass pavilion in Denver. While my sister Madison's wedding was a performance for a social circle built on credit and pretension, this event is a testament to an ascent they didn't even know was happening. The deck beneath my heels is solid, stable, and worth more than the Hartford Colonial my father used as a cage. And as I look out at the horizon where the sky meets the Tyrrhenian Sea, I feel no malice, only the cold satisfaction of a mission accomplished. Julian stands at the altar, his eyes reflecting a deep understanding of the journey it took for me to stand here. A man who knows that my intensity is not a distraction but my greatest asset. The contrast between this moment and that dismissive 15-cent voicemail is so vast it borders on the cosmic. A reminder that those who attempt to classify you as a spare part usually do so because they are terrified of your true utility. My parents and Madison are thousands of miles away, likely still circulating the same tired stories in their shrinking Connecticut circles, completely unaware that the daughter they discarded is currently hosting a summit of global influence on a floating palace. I am no longer the distraction or the liability. I am the commander of my own life, draped in silk and surrounded by the kind of loyalty that isn't bought with a Yale tuition check or a family name. The wind catches my veil, but I don't flinch, my gaze fixed on the man who chose me for the soldier and the woman I am, rather than the aesthetic I could provide for a photograph. Family isn't the people who share your blood. It is the people who see your worth when you are covered in the dust of the climb and stay to celebrate when you finally reach the summit. As the officiant begins to speak, the only sound I hear is the gentle lap of the waves against the hull, a rhythmic confirmation that the blueprints of my life have been successfully redrawn, and this time the structure is unbreakable. The real strike, the surgical maneuver that finally dismantled the hierarchy of my past, didn't happen with a shouted confrontation or a tearful letter, but through the cold, glowing screens of the devices my family prizes so dearly. I had orchestrated the coverage with the same logistical precision I once used to coordinate fuel resupplies in the desert, ensuring that our wedding wasn't just an event but a global broadcast of my autonomy. Within 48 hours, the ceremony was featured as a centerpiece on a major luxury lifestyle YouTube channel and splashed across Vogue's digital edition under a headline about modern power couples. The high-definition cinematography captured every devastating detail that my mother and Madison would instantly recognize as a standard far beyond their reach, starting with the $45,000 floral arrangements composed of rare white O'Hara roses and cascading orchids that draped over the yacht's stern like a frozen waterfall. The cameras lingered on the 5-course dinner served on Hermès Blues Deleurs porcelain, where the wine pairings alone featured bottles of 2005 Chateau Margaux that retailed for $800 each. A price point that made my father's exclusive cellar look like a collection of supermarket shelf fillers. I looked radiant in the footage, my skin glowing under the Mediterranean sun and my bespoke silk gown catching the light with a subtle, expensive shimmer that no off-the-rack Ralph Lauren could ever emulate. I wasn't just a bride. I looked powerful, grounded, and utterly unreachable, a woman who had transitioned from a spare part in a Hartford Colonial to a central figure in a world of international influence. I didn't bother sending a formal rejection or an invitation to my parents because I knew that the internet would deliver the news with a cold, relentless efficiency that no registered mail could match. I could almost picture my mother sitting in her breakfast nook, her hands shaking as she scrolled through the Vogue gallery, seeing the daughter she deemed a distraction, standing alongside 4-star generals and billionaire investors. I could imagine Madison watching the YouTube feature in her exclusive Denver pavilion, realizing that the small and stress-free life she had curated for herself was nothing more than a shallow pond compared to the ocean I was now navigating. The silence from my phone was the most beautiful sound I had heard in years, a tactical victory that required no further engagement on my part. I had allowed them to exile me, to classify me as a liability, and in response, I had simply built a reality so magnificent that their permission was no longer required for my existence. They wanted a life of aesthetic perfection, but they had forgotten that the most beautiful structures are the ones built to withstand the greatest pressure. As the video of our first dance played out for millions of viewers, showing Julian and me silhouetted against the cliffs of Amalfi, I felt the final tether to their disapproval snap. I had used the very tools of social capital they worshipped to demonstrate that I had surpassed them in every measurable metric of success and dignity. Family is often described as a circle, but for me, it had become a ladder, and I had finally climbed high enough that the voices from the bottom were nothing but a faint, indistinguishable hum. The mission wasn't just to survive their rejection. It was to thrive so visibly that my silence became their loudest punishment. I was no longer Claire the soldier or Claire the spare. I was the architect of a life that was finally, truly my own. I can almost see them now, gathered in that cold, cavernous limestone kitchen in Denver, the morning sun hitting the polished sub-zero appliances while the air remains thick with a tension that no high-end ventilation system can scrub away. My mother, Eleanor, likely has her trembling, manicured fingers gripped around a bone china mug of espresso that has gone stone cold as she stares at the 4K footage of my Amalfi wedding playing on her iPad Pro. Beside her, Madison, the golden child whose glow is beginning to dim under the suffocating weight of reality, is watching the viral video of the sister she erased being toasted by 4-star generals and tech titans whose net worths make our father's construction company look like a backyard hobby. The silence in that kitchen must be deafening, a vacuum where their pride used to live, as they watch me glide across a mega-yacht deck in a $12,000 silk gown that radiates a level of class they tried to buy but never actually possessed. They are seeing the distraction, the military intensity, and the spare part transformed into a woman who is utterly untouchable, a woman who didn't just survive their exile but used it as the fuel for a global ascent. While they scroll through the Vogue digital spread, noting the $45,000 floral arrangements and the guests who represent the true architecture of global power, the cracks in their own facade are finally becoming impossible to plaster over. Madison's perfect life with Julian is already hemorrhaging at the seams, straining under $85,000 of high-interest credit card debt and a lifestyle subsidized by a failing startup that is burning through its last round of seed funding. The glass pavilion in Denver, the sunset ceremony, and the curated aesthetic were all built on the shifting sands of my father's ego and a mountain of leveraged loans that are starting to come due. I can imagine the bitter taste of the realization hitting them. The daughter they discarded to keep their event stress-free is now the most successful person to ever carry the Donovan name, and she did it without a single cent of their tainted inheritance or a single word of their hollow encouragement. They wanted a life of prestige, but they were so busy polishing the brass on their sinking ship that they never noticed I was building an unsinkable fleet of my own. The contrast is absolute, a surgical bisection of our destinies that no amount of social maneuvering can fix now. As they watch Julian take my hand on that teak deck, the Amalfi cliffs glowing like gold in the background, they have to face the cold, hard fact that I am no longer a variable they can control or a stain they can bleach out of their history. I have become the sun they are forced to orbit, a source of light and power that they can only observe from the shadows of their own mounting failures. My father probably looks at the screen and sees not a daughter, but the ultimate lost investment, a powerhouse of discipline and capital that he foolishly wrote off as a liability. They are trapped in their million-dollar colonial cage, surrounded by the expensive things they can no longer truly afford, while I am sailing toward a horizon they aren't even allowed to map. Family isn't the people who share your blood. Family is the people who stay when the truth comes out, and the truth is that the Donovans are a crumbling empire, and I am the one who walked away to build a kingdom. As the video loops back to the beginning showing my radiant, armored smile, I know that for the first time in 28 years, the silence coming from Denver isn't a rejection. It's a surrender. The begging phase officially commenced at precisely 2:45 a.m., announced by the relentless rhythmic vibration of my iPhone 15 Pro against the nightstand of my villa, a digital franticness that cut through the peaceful silence of the Italian coast. I rolled over, the high-thread count Egyptian cotton sheets shifting with a soft rustle, and watched the screen illuminate with a flurry of notifications from Madison that signaled a total collapse of her previously curated arrogance. The tone had shifted with the violent desperation of a structural failure, moving from the sharp, melodic condescension of the boutique in Denver to a pathetic, whimpering crawl through the dirt. She was sending paragraph after paragraph of revisionist history, claiming through a series of blue-eye message bubbles that she had always regretted the wedding mishap and that the exclusion was just a misunderstanding fueled by the stress of the planning. But the true motivation for this sudden sisterly affection appeared 3 scrolls down, where she mentioned a $20,000 bridge loan she desperately needed to keep her failing boutique from being shuttered by creditors who didn't care about her Ivy League pedigree or her husband's stagnant tech startup. As I sat up, the moonlight reflecting off the Mediterranean and casting long, cold shadows across the marble floor, a notification for a new voicemail appeared from my mother, Eleanor. I hit play, and instead of the crisp CEO-like dismissal I had received months ago, I was met with the sound of jagged performative sobbing that sounded like a transmission from a sinking ship. She was calling me her brave hero, her strong and resilient daughter, using words that felt oily and wrong in a mouth that had previously categorized me as a military distraction. The desperation reached a fever pitch when she actually had the audacity to suggest that the family fly out to San Diego to reconnect and heal our wounds, adding a tentative hopeful inquiry about whether we could send my husband's Gulfstream G650 private jet to pick them up so they could travel in a manner befitting our new social standing. It was a staggering display of parasitic logic, an attempt to bridge a chasm they had spent decades digging with a few minutes of hollow flattery and a request for a financial bailout. I listened to the recording twice, my expression as immobile and analytical as it had been during the most intense briefings at Fort Carson, noting the exact moment her voice cracked with the realization that their leverage had evaporated. They weren't seeking a daughter or a sister. They were seeking a life raft constructed from the very sweat and discipline they had mocked. The scent of the expensive Amalfi lemons outside my window seemed to sharpen as I realized that my family had finally hit the bedrock of their own insolvency, both financial and moral. They wanted the benefits of my ascent without ever having participated in the climb, and they expected me to provide a VIP seat for the very people who had told me I wasn't fit for a glass pavilion. I looked at the yellow legal pad I still kept in my travel bag, the one where I had listed my own worth when I had nothing but a $9 bottle of bourbon and a broken heart, and I realized that the bridge loan Madison needed was a drop in the ocean compared to the debt of loyalty they owed me. Family is a bond that is forged in the fire of mutual respect, not a line of credit you can tap into when your own vanity-driven empire begins to crumble under the weight of $85,000 in credit card debt. I didn't reply to the texts or the voicemail, instead setting the phone face down on the nightstand and watching the digital glow fade into nothingness, because some structures are too far gone to be saved by a renovation, and my family was a building that had long since been condemned by its own architect. I sat on my expansive terrace in San Diego, the morning air crisp with the scent of saltwater and high-end espresso, slowly sipping a perfectly layered macchiato from a delicate white porcelain cup. The Pacific Ocean stretched out before me like a sheet of hammered silver, reflecting a sun that felt warmer and more honest than any smile I had ever received in that Hartford colonial. My iPad Pro lay on the wrought iron table, its screen glowing with the digital wreckage Madison had sent as a desperate offering. A PDF file she titled Proof of Hardship, as if our relationship were a high-interest loan negotiation. I scrolled through the pages with the clinical detachment of an auditor, watching a chaotic mess of 14 overdue notices from creditors like American Express and Chase Bank flicker past, punctuated by a formal, terrifying letter regarding a pending foreclosure on their so-called dream home. The numbers were staggering, revealing a life sustained by the fumes of a dying construction empire and the reckless vanity of people who spent thousands on gala tickets while their mortgage interest compounded like a terminal illness. I felt a profound wave of calm wash over me as I realized that this sudden, frantic outpouring of love was nothing more than a calculated reaction to the net worth I had built while they were busy erasing me from their guest lists. Their affection was a commodity, priced exactly at the cost of their outstanding debts, and the brave hero my mother described in her sobbing voicemail was merely a personified bank account they hoped to liquidate. Madison had even included a spreadsheet of her boutique's losses, a pathetic trail of red ink that proved she had no more business running a luxury retail space than I had trying to please people who valued a glass pavilion over a daughter's sacrifice. I looked at the foreclosure notice for the property they had once used as a weapon of exclusion, seeing the legal language that spelled the end of their aesthetic perfection, and I felt absolutely nothing but the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had already moved on. The irony was as thick as the sea mist. They had exiled me to keep their lives stress-free, and now the very stress they feared was the only thing bringing them back to my doorstep, begging for a seat on a private jet they hadn't earned. I set the cup down, the soft clink of porcelain on metal sounding like a period at the end of a long, exhausting sentence, and turned my gaze back to the horizon where a lone cargo ship was cutting through the swells. They didn't want Claire, the staff sergeant, the woman who had managed millions in government equipment and led convoys through storms. They wanted Claire, the tech CEO's wife, the woman with the liquid assets and the legal team that could make their financial sins disappear. I realized in that moment that my family's love was a closed shop that only opened its doors when the lights were about to be turned off, and I had no intention of being the one to pay their utility bill. Family is supposed to be the bedrock, the immutable foundation that remains when the storms of life strip everything else away. But the Donovans were a facade of limestone and lies that was finally collapsing under its own hollow weight. I took another slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest, and decided that the most powerful thing I could do was to remain as unreachable as the horizon I was staring at. They had given me the gift of exile, and I was going to honor it by staying exactly where I was, prosperous, protected, and permanently out of their reach. I decided to grant them the audience they had been begging for, not in a glass pavilion or a high-rise office, but through the cold, impartial medium of a recorded Zoom call that I titled Family Clarity Meeting with the clinical precision of a military briefing. I sat in my home office in San Diego, the sunlight filtered through custom motorized blinds, looking into the 4K webcam with a face that was as unreadable as a tactical map. On the other end of the line, 3 small windows revealed the Donovans in their Hartford kitchen, their faces pale and eyes rimmed with the red of exhaustion and financial terror, looking like a unit that had completely lost its chain of command. I didn't scream, I didn't offer a single syllable of the emotional vulnerability they expected to exploit, and I certainly didn't acknowledge the brave hero labels they were still trying to pin on me like cheap participation trophies. Instead, I simply clicked share screen and filled their monitors with a digital ledger I had painstakingly compiled. A chronological audit of every graduation, holiday, and milestone where I had been systematically excluded, annotated with the exact costs they had spent on Madison's luxury lifestyle while I was saving every cent of my hazardous duty pay. The silence on the call was absolute as I played the audio of that 2019 voicemail, my mother's dismissive voice echoing through their expensive speakers, reminding them of the moment they officially classified me as a distraction rather than a daughter. I watched my father, the construction mogul whose empire was now a house of cards, flinch as the audio reached the part where he had sanctioned my exile to keep Madison's big day stress-free. I looked directly into the camera, my posture perfect and my voice steady, and told them with a calm that was far more devastating than anger that I am a logistics expert trained by the finest military in the world. I informed them that I had calculated the return on investment for this relationship over the last decade, accounting for every emotional withdrawal and every ignored contribution, and the final numbers had landed at exactly 0. I watched Madison's jaw drop, her eyes darting to the overdue notices I had quietly included in the sidebar of my presentation, realizing that I wasn't just aware of her failure, I was indifferent to it. I concluded the meeting by informing them that my time, much like my loyalty, was no longer a free resource for them to deplete whenever their bank accounts ran dry or their social standing wavered. I told them that any further attempts at contact, whether through desperate texts, sobbing voicemails, or requests for private jet charters, would be handled exclusively by my legal counsel at a rate of $450 per hour, billed directly to their dwindling estate. I watched the realization sink in that I wasn't just a sister who had made it big. I was a sovereign entity who had built a life they were no longer authorized to enter. There was no dramatic goodbye, no final plea for understanding, just the cold, mechanical click of the leave meeting button that severed the connection once and for all. I sat there for a moment in the silence of my office, the scent of high-end espresso still lingering in the air, feeling the weight of 28 years of rejection finally lifting. Family isn't a bloodline you are forced to subsidize. It is a partnership of mutual respect. And when the logistics of that partnership fail, the only rational move is to cut the supply line. I turned off my monitor, the digital glow fading into a peaceful darkness, and realized that for the first time in my life, the only numbers I needed to worry about were the ones that belonged to me. The aftermath was not an explosion but a controlled demolition, a clean break that left the landscape of my life unrecognizable to the people who once tried to map it for me. Back in Denver, the house of cards finally folded under the weight of its own vanity as Madison's boutique, that polished monument to her unearned status, officially filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy with over $200,000 in accumulated liabilities. I watched from a distance through the cold data of public filings, as my parents were forced to sell the Hartford Colonial at a loss and downsize to a utilitarian 1,200 square foot condo in a part of town they would have previously considered beneath their zip code. There are no more $12,000 silk dresses or sunset ceremonies in glass pavilions for them now. Only the stark reality of property taxes they can barely cover and a daughter who no longer answers the phone. My mother's desperate voicemails eventually stopped, replaced by a hollow silence that smells of stale coffee and the realization that their golden child was nothing more than a gilded anchor dragging them into the depths of their own financial incompetence. Meanwhile, my own trajectory remained as steady and relentless as a C-17 on a long-haul flight, my career advancing with the precision I had cultivated since the day I first traded my name for a serial number. I pinned on the gold leaves of a major, my uniform crisp and heavy with the ribbons of earned respect, moving into a senior logistics role at the Pentagon where I manage budgets that make my father's construction projects look like lemonade stands. But the true measure of my ascent isn't found in my rank or the sleek glass and steel penthouse I share with Julian overlooking the Potomac, but in the legacy I am building with the wealth they once tried to gatekeep. I established the Aegis Scholarship Fund, a $3 million endowment specifically designed to provide full-ride Ivy League educations for the children of fallen soldiers, the very same education my father bought for Madison, but this time, it is earned through the ultimate sacrifice of heroes. I spend my weekends reviewing applications from young men and women who know the value of grit, offering them the seat at the table that was denied to me, and doing it with a signature that carries more weight than the Donovan name ever did. I stand on my balcony now, watching the sun dip below the Virginia skyline, a glass of 20-year-old Highland Park in my hand and a sense of absolute sovereignty in my chest. The girl who once sat at a dusty desk at Fort Carson, gripping a cracked iPhone and listening to a 15-cent execution of her family ties, is gone, replaced by a woman who doesn't need to ask for permission to exist. I realized long ago that family isn't a blood oath you are forced to honor while they sharpen the knives behind your back. It is a tactical alliance of the soul, and I have found mine in the soldiers I lead, the man I love, and the mission I serve. My parents and Madison are footnotes in a story they thought they were writing, characters who were edited out because they couldn't handle the complexity of the protagonist. I am no longer the spare part waiting for a seat at their table, hoping for a crumb of validation from people who view love as a luxury tax. I have built my own foundation, drafted my own blueprints, and secured my own perimeter with a level of technical and emotional mastery they will never comprehend. I don't just have a seat anymore. I own the entire building, and the view from the top is finally, perfectly stress-free.